Actually, that's one of those ones where the copyright laws will come in if I play more than 30 seconds of that. Anyhow, welcome. It is Saturday, February 28th, and it's about 9 o'clock in the morning. I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning to discover that indeed we had begun a war with Iran. It's tough to do when you're a one-man show sometimes. Hi, I'm Darren Moore, and this is Another Way. I'm your conservative bookish beach bum, bunkered into a private guarded island here in the Redneck Riviera. And on this show, Another Way, I try to talk about things in a deeper and wider way than you're going to get anywhere else in the media. And so, after 47 years of being at war with us, American President Trump has declared war on the ruling mullahocracy, the mullahs in Iran, with the expressed intent to change the regime. For decades, they've hid and continued their nuclear enrichment program and their weapons programs while committing to agreements in which they said that they wouldn't continue or try to develop a nuclear enrichment program. Yesterday, Friday, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, announced, surprisingly, that they had determined Iran had built a deep underground bunker in Isfahan into which they had housed all of their highly enriched uranium that survived last year's Midnight Hammer operation, in which the Americans obliterated their 3 enrichment facilities. We've known for 47 years that Iran has not been dealing in good faith with the rest of the world. But the IAEA report was a bit surprising because this organization usually tries to help buoy the hopes that peaceful agreements can be reached through negotiation. But this report, coming on the day just after the failed talks in Geneva, where Iran offered no concessions regarding its enrichment program, could only have one effect, and that is to expose to everybody in the world who held out hope that a deal could be struck that Iran was instead up to its old tricks of hiding its intentions to develop nuclear weapons, while simultaneously promising and assuring the world that they only wanted peaceful nuclear power. If you only wanted peaceful nuclear power, you would never enrich it to 60%. That's that last stage. A couple weeks after that, you can have a nuclear bomb. And so, as I've said, I think it went down just as I predicted, and I am thrilled with what I've heard so far. If you want to hear it was yesterday, I gave my predictive talk about how the war would take place, how it would go down, and why. And so far, I've been proven totally right on every facet of the attack. So far, I've only heard of 4 fatalities outside of Iran, and those were apparently collateral damage in an obscure town in Syria, where 4 people were killed in their homes by a missile surely headed to Israel. I saw a report from the Jerusalem Post, which gave me the most hope. It said that 125 missiles were launched at Israel, and 90 of them were shot down before they even reached Israeli airspace. The remaining 35 were also intercepted in Israel. So far, the only punch that seems to have landed was a missile strike out of Lebanon that tore a hole through a few of the top floors in an evacuated building in North Israel. Iran said that it had attacked 4 different countries: Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And it appears that almost all of the missiles were intercepted and that there have been no fatalities anywhere, except for the 4 in Syria, of course. One of the missiles that made it through struck a compound in Bahrain of the Navy's 5th Fleet. And at first, the footage just looked terrible. It looked like a large hit, but apparently it only struck a warehouse and there were no casualties. So dodged a bullet there. What this means then is that our surprise attack caught them with their pants down and their missiles exposed. I suspect that the daytime attack was timed when confidence was high that they knew where the Ayatollah was and that his home and headquarters may have been the very first 2 bombs to rain down in this war. Just before I started recording this video, I read a report that Israel has asserted that these first 2 strikes killed members of the top Iranian leadership. They stopped short of saying that the Ayatollah was one of them or the president. So yesterday, as I was putting the finishing touches on my episode predicting what our war plans would be, our militaries were planning on doing exactly what I had predicted. I woke up as usual at 4 in the morning and checked my phone, and sure enough, we were at war. I had planned on shooting the final draft of my predictive episode this morning, but you'll just have to watch that dress rehearsal video that I posted yesterday afternoon, in which I lay out what I thought would happen. Let me just give you what I basically said we would do. Is first of all, I made the distinction between the three branches, so to speak, of the Iranian military. The first is the Artesh, which is the regular army. These are people that are military people that are loyal to the people of Iran. Secondly are the Sepah. This is the Iranian Republican Guard Corps. These are the fanatical dead-enders who are loyal to the regime. And I suggested that we needed to wipe out these people entirely. The third are the Faraja. The Faraja are the police force. They're the Gestapo, they're the secret police, they're Hitler's brown shirts, they're the Stasi, the mafia, all rolled into one. These are the sadistic bastards. And these are the ones that prowl the streets looking to abuse women for not wearing the right head scarves, and really are the ones in charge of protecting on the ground the regime and suppressing dissent. Along with them is a volunteer force called the Basij, and apparently there's like 300,000 of these people that are Iranian regime loyalists, and they're fanatical. And I've even seen reports where it says that the Basij is actually the ones that did most of the killing of the protesters last month. And so my whole war plan was that we would, of course, take out as many of the senior leadership as we could, because the whole point of war is to kill or cower as many of the ruling class and their military apparatus. Keep killing until you find someone in that ruling class that either you wipe the entire ruling class out and you make space for a new ruling class to come in and take over that will be solicitous to American demands, or you just keep killing until you find someone who's willing to help you out here. And so my whole point was that that I predicted, or at least I suspected, that what might end up happening is that one of the members of the Artesh, the regular army, one of the top leaders there, will end up being chosen by us to be an interim leader in Iran, maintain order. But that we needed to completely obliterate the Republican Guard, the Sepah, and just wipe those guys out as much as possible until we reach a surrender. Many of them were fighting in Iraq, and it was shocking to American troops how many of them were willing to surrender to us in Iraq. And so they're not as loyal as we might think. And it appears that if there was anything that I was wrong about, and we'll see, because in the fog of war, the first casualty is the truth. We have no idea how much of the Republican Guard installations were completely obliterated, how much of it was that we were attacking hardware instead of their human capital. But nonetheless, in his speech, Trump said that if you lay down your arms, we'll give you immunity. Strange word, immunity. And so instead of just clemency, instead of just saying, hey, we're going to forgive you, he's saying, no, lay down your arms. And then he told the Iranian people to just wait out these bomb attacks and then go in there and take over the regime. How they were supposed to do that, he didn't make clear. They are obviously unarmed. I suspect that there are lots of back channel operations going on now, talking with leading members of the Artesh in order to figure out how to arm the people, or perhaps they're just putting together forces in the Artesh to march in to Tehran and take over. It seems that the strike went off without a hitch because they didn't hear it coming, and immediately the entire communications apparatus was knocked out. So they did not have the ability to communicate to all the various tentacles of their military. And so, however, as we know, they had already begun pre-fueling their ballistic missiles a couple days ago, while the talks in Geneva were failing. And so it appears that virtually, as I said in my talk yesterday, that these interceptor missiles, our anti-missile defense system has to be perfect, because any of these bombs that get through, any of these missiles that get through can do major damage to us. And so far, it appears that the only punch they've landed on the American military is that warehouse in Bahrain, in which there were no casualties, no injuries, no fatalities. And so it's interesting that the UAE they're bragging about how they shot down all of their missiles. And what is also interesting is when you think about, and I'll talk more about this here in a bit, but when you think about Qatar is really Iran's only ally in the Persian Gulf now. And even Qatar expressed, and it'll be interesting to see whether it was kind of a feigned protest, but they apparently are outraged that Iran struck them as well. And even though they were obviously trying to hit U.S. forces like they did last year in a token response to our attack on their nuclear sites in Operation Midnight Hammer. And so let me just talk about some of the demographics of the region that I think are things that you need to know. If you saw yesterday's talk, you're probably wondering what all these little bars and numbers are. The numbers reflect the size of the population. And first of all, there are 19 countries that are listed. 18 countries that I've graphed out here that are Mediterranean countries, or excuse me, Arabian, Middle Eastern countries. And of course, I got Persia in there as well. But also, India, for example, is included in these statistics, because what I wanted to do is show how their populations compare, and how their gross domestic product compares. And then the third number, if you're able to read it, is their per capita income. And of course, it's almost folly to talk about Arabian statehood, because they're really not nations. We want to think of them as Westerners. We want to think of them as nations, but really what they are is it's been called, they're tribes with flags. There's not the kind of secular loyalty to the nation state that we are so used to in the Western world. And this is one of the big mistakes. It was one of the big blind spots that we had when we went into Iraq, is that the taking out of Saddam Hussein, which happened actually pretty quickly. And, Bush went aboard that aircraft carrier with the banner that says mission accomplished on it. And he took a lot of heat for doing it, because we hadn't found Saddam Hussein at that point. We had just nearly toppled the regime. But the truth of the matter was, at that point, and we did find, I forgot his name already, Saddam Hussein months later. We killed his two sons, Uday and Qusay, a month later. The Hydra had been killed at that point. And so the mission had been accomplished. The problem is that we decided to stick around and get in the middle of all this tribal warfare in Iraq, where you have, and this is what the bars are. If it's green with a little red on it, that's the percentage of Shia versus Sunni. Whereas in Iraq, it's 20% Sunni and 80% Shia. In Turkey, it's like 90% Sunni and 10% Shia. So what's interesting here is that for 47 years, American diplomacy has failed to get Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions, to stop funding terrorist cells across the region. They, of course, made Syria, and this is one of the things that, let me just cut to the chase here. For the majority of 30-some plus years, Americans had been trying to cower Iran into joining the modern and free-loving capitalistic world. And Iran just simply didn't have that ambition. One of the main mistakes that Americans make is that they do not understand three main components about dealing with particularly Middle Eastern and Muslim countries. And that is the difference between interest, values, and then let's just call it honor. And so, whereas, for example, interests may overlap and we're able to do deals with people regarding our shared interest, those are only temporary so long as those interests are being met, okay? Far more important are the values. And the values of Iran, we can talk till we're blue in the face. We are not going to change the values of the leaders of Iran. Think back to what Ayatollah Khomeini said when he came into office. He said, I don't really care about Iran necessarily. He actually thinks that a patriotism is a form of heresy. Okay, the nation state again just does not apply in the Western world. And why is that? Well, another blind spot that the Westerners have is that we're used to the idea of separation of church and state, that there are two swords, one for the ordering of our souls, and that's obviously religion, and the second is the state, the secular state, which is in charge of maintaining order in our society. And we've gotten pretty used to that, and it's worked pretty well, and it's allowed this tremendous advance in Western civilization of peace and prosperity, with a few hiccups, of course. We could say that in the 20th century, the two world wars were an indication of what happens when men stop believing in God, and two of the formerly most Christian countries in the nation went to war with one another. And so it doesn't always work well, but nonetheless, the point is that there's a separation of church and state in the Western world, in Christendom. That is not the case in Islam. In Islam, there's only one law, and that's for the soul and for the state. And so it's very difficult to deal with folks who do not have the capacity to have secular loyalty towards a sovereign state. And they instead believe that Sharia law is the only law that's worth following. And that's why it's so very difficult for people from Islam to come to America and assimilate, is because not only like Turkey's president told his immigrants to Germany, he says you have a responsibility not to assimilate to the German ways. Imagine just how bad it is now in Europe, now that after Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, and there's this huge migration into Europe. There's a tremendous amount of culture and civilization being supplanted by an invasionary force. Okay, whether they are taking up arms against those people or not is not the question. The fact that you cannot have two cultures living side by side and without one supplanting the other, it just doesn't work that way. And so any large immigration movement, any large mass of immigrants that don't assimilate to their host country will eventually become a menace. And we've seen that to some degree here in America with the mass immigration of Hispanics. But here's the rub. The Hispanics share the same values as us. Most of them are Catholic, God love them, and most of them they work harder than most Protestants, okay? And so they fit in very well. We embrace them. And Americans have a natural tendency to embrace any immigrant that wants to be an American, okay? And so not all of the immigrants coming up from Mexico are lawbreakers on one hand, or people who are just merely trying to take advantage of the largesse of our overinflated welfare state, okay? The vast majority of Hispanics coming into America are hardworking people in search of the American dream. And what's the American dream is essentially liberty and prosperity, okay? And so they are willing to live in peace and harmony with their neighbors. That doesn't necessarily happen when Islamists, particularly Islamists who believe kind of this fascist idea that the state is the enforcer of the religion as well. When you have those people move into Western civilization, you just have, it's oil and water. They just don't mix. And so anyways, so we've been trying to change Iran's values by trying to appeal to his interests. And we think that economic sanctions are going to change this, when really the Iranians, at least the mullahs, don't really care about any of that. They obviously don't care about their people. Instead, what they have been doing for the last 47 years have been doing everything they can to hang on. And in the process, what is actually interesting is, and I really want to get to this point, is that for the longest time, one president after another tried to get Iran to join the world of free nations and the free flow of capitalism. And they simply wouldn't do it. Instead, one president tried a different tactic, which is surrender, and that was Obama. And so essentially what he did is he gave them, gee whiz, $400 billion worth of, on pallets of cash, $100 bills he sent back to them, freed up many of these assets that had been seized, rolled back all of the sanctions, and put them on a course of nuclear enrichment that would sunset last year, as a matter of fact. So according to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which is really just a big POS, it enabled the Iranians to basically continue to do what they basically gave them everything they want, everything that they could possibly want. There was no restriction on anything except the degree to which they could enrich their uranium. And so, they made them that deal. It took them a couple of years to get it in place. It was on the table and functioning for a couple of years, and then Trump came in and pulled us right on out of it. And of course, realized that it was an awful deal that was basically giving hundreds of billions of dollars to the largest sponsor of terrorism on the planet. And by that, we can say, just go through the list of things that Iran has done over the years, starting with, and this is, it's one of my main critiques of Ronald Reagan, is of course, the Iranians who had taken the hostages for 444 days, were not willing to give them up because they were not afraid of Carter. Carter made it clear that no armed forces would be used to try to get them, to try to free them. And then the helicopters crashed in the desert on the way to try to do that. And after that, they knew they had Carter right where they wanted, but they released the hostages when Reagan came because they were afraid he was going to use some cowboy diplomacy and that he was going to wipe them out. But it was certainly, taking hostages like that is a perfect casus belli. It's certainly a warlike act. It's an act of war that should have been reciprocated as one. We got our troops back, but then what ended up happening is they, of course, bombed our Marines in Beirut, and Reagan pulled out and said, basically, just wanted out of there. And part of the reason for this, and it's very important to understand, is a lot of this goes back to the fact that Iran is Russia's agent in the Middle East. They have since also become China's agent in the Middle East, and this is kind of an axis of evil, let's call it. At least they're enemies of ours to some degree, although China's one of our greatest trading partners. There's no doubt that they have evil intentions to bring us down. And so Iran, we can always go back to that 53 coup d'etat that the CIA helped sponsor to get rid of a Soviet aligned leader in Iran and put in an American supporting westernized Shah. And, the monarchy has like 15 generations prior to that Shah. But nonetheless, the big mistake, we actually leaned on the Shah not to put down the revolution. What a huge mistake. But the one thing that the Russians certainly knew is that they were doing everything they could to support any kind of force that was anti the United States, anything that was anti the West, anything that was anti-Europe. And they came to the easy conclusion that one of the best ways to do that was that kind of sentiment could be stoked in the Middle East. And so they were very interested in setting up little communist allied dictatorships and despots all over the Middle East because they knew that they could inflame them into acts of terrorism against the Western world. And so it was in our best interest in many ways to make sure that as many of these, in fighting the Cold War against Russia, that as many of these countries, especially because they had this unlimited apparently amount of wealth due to the oil in their ground, it was definitely in our interest to have as many Western-leaning despots in our camp instead of the Russian camp during the Cold War. After World War II, these countries which had been allied with Germany and the Nazis particularly, and that's the thing, is that the Nazi ideology, which I should point out collapsed in Germany very quickly once we defeated Hitler The people immediately rejected Nazism, just as in Russia, when the wall fell, people completely turned on communism, even though many people were anti-communist beforehand. But it suddenly became, the cause du jour to hate on communism. And so I think the same thing is going to happen with Iran, that as soon as the heads of this regime are cut off, the entire ideology, whatever support that they do have, will immediately tumble. And one of the interesting things I read, I can't remember where now, but said that during the age of Russia, there were only 10% that would admit that they were anti the regime, anti the communist regime. And, they got, it's kind of the same thing that happens in Iran, that if you speak out against the regime, you get sent to the Gulag archipelago, or you get to in Iran, you get sent into Evin prison, which is the notorious prison, has all the torture rooms there in Iran. And so, but the thing that's interesting is Iran, there's 70% of the people being polled that say that they're anti the regime. And so this huge mass demonstrations that take place apparently every 3 years or so, we never had that in Russia. And when it was attempted in China last, we all remember what happened in the Tiananmen Square. And so Iran is ripe for regime change. But we've been constantly playing this game of patty cake, trying to think that economic incentives will get them to stop. And it's just not in their interest to do that. And it does not align with their values either. And that's the main thing that we need to take from this, is to understand that Iran does not value the same things that we value. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia, who I think is only marginally less an enemy of ours than Iran, which is by far the top state sponsor of terrorism in the world today. I think that Saudi Arabia is right behind them. Their Wahhabist movement, which has basically indoctrinated the entire dark continent with a very anti-Western, anti-Semitic ideology that is Islamism. It's that fascistic approach to the Muslim world moving forward, the idea of conquest. And so, but going back to my point here is that when the Nazis were defeated, that ideology, that radical racialist ideology, still persisted in Iran. And so you basically have the Ayatollah is just kind of the new reincarnation of Hitler in the world. And so they do everything and they use all of the talking points. The main point that they try to do is they try to get their people to hate on the West, death to America, death to Israel, because if they can focus the people's hate on someone else, then they can deflect the hatred at the leaders there in Iran. And so this is kind of the way they do it in the Muslim world, or at least in the Middle East, I should say. I always make the point that over in Indonesia, which is actually the largest Muslim country on the planet, the people don't have this burning hatred for the West, and we get along quite well with them. In fact, they're doing pretty well capitalistically as well. And so there's a major golden opportunity here with Iran, that when we cut off the Hydra's main head here, the whole damn dragon will die. And this is the other thing I pointed out in the other video, is that Iranians, not only 70% of them are anti the regime, but 70% of Iranians are actually very young. They're under the age of 35. And the mullahs made a huge mistake by sending the best and brightest of the Iranian kids into Western schools to become educated. And so when they came back from college, because they had to, otherwise their families would have been whacked by the mullahocracy. When they came back, they were Western, more or less. And so they've been the trendsetters in Iran for 30 years. And so that's why there's this huge, momentous movement against the regime. They don't want this radical regime anymore. But so Obama comes in, and what does he do? Now, I'm not going to mention that Valerie Jarrett, his longest serving senior White House advisor, was Iranian, but nonetheless, basically, Obama's strategy was basically to surrender to Iran. If you want to read basically the policy that he employed, it was written by a feckless CIA director, Robert Baer, and his book, The Devil We Know. He also wrote a book which says See No Evil. And so in other words, he wanted to basically give Iran whatever the heck they wanted. And he had like an 8-point plan here to basically, bend over and grab the knees. And it was this policy, that's in here somewhere. Wait a minute. I'm sure it's in here listed. There it is. Okay. So, just hold this up here in case you want to hit pause and read my notes to this terrible plan that Obama ended up adopting, which was basically give the Iranians whatever they want, guarantee Iranian internal security, do joint patrols in the Persian Gulf together, ease the embargo on Iran, grant Iran a defined security role in Iraq. Basically, everything that we were fighting for in Iraq, we should just now turn over to Iran, and also in Afghanistan. UN Resolution 242, which would negotiate the Israeli settlements. Basically, you wanted to have Israel moved back to its borders prior to 1967. Incorporate Hezbollah's military into the Lebanese army. Of course, that's the main problem in Lebanon. Lebanon, if you know it at all, used to be, and one of my favorite books on Lebanon is written by one of my all-time favorite thinkers on the planet, Roger Scruton, who spent a lot of time in Lebanon and talked about how you want to talk about multiculturalism. One of the few places that it ever really did work was in Lebanon, and on that big mountain, Maronites, Chaldeans, Sunni, Shia, Druze, and Jews got along relatively well for centuries. And then what ended up happening is Iran couldn't have any of that. And so they sponsored the Syrians to go in there and screw it all up. They founded Hezbollah and assassinated the Cedar revolutionaries. They killed Pierre Gamaliel, or the brother of Pierre Gamaliel and his son. And it was just a total bloodbath because Hezbollah basically oppressed the Sunni minorities there. And ran out all the Jews and the Christians and the Maronites and all that stuff. And so now it's just a terrible mess there. But Lebanon used to be kind of the emerald city of the Middle East, and now it's a terrible mess with what Hezbollah has done to it. And he also wanted to let Iranians take over Mecca, fight the war for Mecca if they wanted to. Now that's one thing that Obama. And here, I'll just finish the second page here in case you want to read these as well. You hit pause. Okay, so the idea that Obama had for Iran was to create this kind of Shia crescent that would cause what he used the term was creative tension between the Shia and Sunni world. Okay, this is one of the most important things to understand about the region, of course, is that we are basically getting in between, and this is what we did in Iraq, is we got in the middle of the battle of the Hatfields and McCoys. Okay, they don't recognize secular justice. They only recognize, and that's the other most important thing that you can understand about the differences between our culture. Christians, in our prayers every day, we say, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." That is not the way Islam works. That religion has very little forgiveness in it, and is more about vengeance, and it's more about conquest, whereas we're about forgiveness and peace and prosperity. And so, nevertheless, Obama kind of felt that the Shia were kind of the underdogs of the region, and so he wanted to empower them in what he would call a creative tension. Kind of this idea of the realists and during the Cold War that felt that the only way to have peace on the planet was to have the balance of powers, okay? And to these people, the idea of Reagan's solution, which is we win, they lose, is unthinkable. And so what Obama wanted to do is create this Shia crescent where Iran, with its forces in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, even though he was Sunni, was still doing the job for Iran. Is from Iran that he got his chemical weapons that he used in his own people, and across that red line that Obama had drawn in the sand. But then this is the other thing, is that when we understand interests and values are the things that really apply in the Middle East, that of course they'll work with anybody who will attack Israel. And that's why Iran not only funded Al-Qaeda, the primarily Sunni terrorist cell, but also they funded the Taliban, and they funded Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Hezbollah. And then, of course, Hamas, run by the PLO, which was kind of one of the main beginning upsettings that took place in Lebanon. And so, and of course, they're using the Yemeni Houthi rebels. And what they're trying to do there is thereby squeeze Saudi Arabia. Iran's ambitions to have nuclear weapons aren't just to wipe out Israel, but rather also, as importantly, as to use, to be able to threaten and destroy the Saudi royals. And so, of course, Iran, once they got this great deal from Obama, they went right back to what they've always done. To them, it was just one more sign that the Americans could be manipulated very easily. And they went right back to enriching uranium, and they used all that money that Obama gave them to further reinforce their terrorist cells across the planet. And so, our goodwill, if that's what we really want to call it, was used against us. But, Obama basically thought that if we had a strong Iran that was no longer mad at us, and a Saudi Arabia that was doing business with us, that we could have, again, a creative tension between the Sunni and Shia factions in the area. And any conflict we could then adjudicate as Americans or with some ultra-national agency like the United Nations, which is such a feckless organization. I was reading this morning that the head of the UN's civil rights organization was talking about how the only people that war hurts are the civilians. These pacifists are just such useful idiots. It's crazy. So the other thing to understand is that we cannot expect our European former allies, and they're still our allies, to be allies in this war. They have been totally emasculated because they've allowed the immigration to be so strong that they've been overrun, and they're deathly afraid of saying anything that might provoke the ire of the Muslims in their country. Last time I was in London, I just could not believe London didn't feel like London anymore. Okay, and last time I was in Paris, I was stunned. The north side of the Champs-Élysées was right there at the Arc de Triomphe. It was like little Persia. I couldn't believe it. There were no Frenchmen there. It was all Iranians. And of course, and Theodore Dalrymple wrote about this in one of his books. He talked about how there's an area that rings Paris called Les Zones, and the Parisian police don't even go into it anymore. It is fully run by Sharia law, and it is, of course, a very high crime district, and that crime seeps out and affects the other parts of Paris. And Paris is so cowed nowadays that they even canceled their New Year's celebration because they were afraid of Islamic terrorism. And so we can't expect the Europeans to stand up for themselves anymore. They might be willing to spend 5% of their budgets on militaries to stand up to Russia from invasion, but do not expect them to be able to stand up to the Muslim immigrants. And this is such a sad thing that's taken place. The last time I was in Germany was 1 year before the big Syrian immigration. And I was there at Christmas, and I'm in Cologne, and I'm looking at that gorgeous cathedral and the Christkindl mark in the square right in its shadow there. And it's just such a happy, unbelievably magical place. Boy, the Germans sure do know how to do Christmas. And it was just an amazing place to visit. And it was just 1 year later that they had those mass rapes from those Syrian immigrants that came in raping the local girls in that same very Christkindl marked in the shadow of one of the great medieval Catholic cathedrals. And, it's just so sad that Angela Merkel let all these Syrians in. And my only point would be that now that the Bashar al-Assad regime has been routed in Syria, and apparently Assad is now up in Moscow in a posh home outside of town where he's enjoying learning macrame. Of all things, he apparently is loving macrame. But Syria has been, its leadership has been overthrown. And here's the other thing, is that Russia completely cut and ran from Syria. They had a base there, and in some ways they were actually producing some kind of order in the region, but nonetheless, when the revolution came that ousted Assad, the Russians left too. And so one of the main things that I've been concerned about in regards to this war is how will Russia and China react when we attack Iran? Will they be drawn into the war? And I saw remarks from President Medvedev this morning that made me think that everything's going to be just fine. Russia is turning its back on Iran the same way that it turned its back on Assad. I wouldn't be surprised. I read a report that the Molocracy has already transferred $85 billion in Bitcoin up to holding banks in Russia. I wouldn't be surprised if as soon as they get there, they get whacked and the Russians take that money. Russia is really, really, really struggling right now. They don't really have arms to sell to anyone anymore. They are barely able to beat little Ukraine in this war. Now it's been 3 years? Has it been 3 years, 4 years now? It's longer than that even. So they've got their hands full over there. And so Russia is not interested in picking a fight with us. I was primarily worried about China. For the better part of a year now, China has been negotiating with Iran. Iran was going to buy some of these ship sinking cruise missiles, that supersonic cruise missiles that flew at a very low level, so that way they couldn't be detected by our typical radar and could maneuver in the last part of their flight to avoid interceptor missiles. And I thought, wow, if China sells those to Iran, that means that China is really on board with helping Iran in their war against us. But it turns out that they did not make that deal. So somehow we've been able to deter China as well. And so that basically leaves Iran totally isolated, particularly if Qatar is truly pissed off at them now. They're all alone here and no one's in their corner. And what ends up happening is if we cut them off, not only does Hezbollah fall, all of their thugs in Syria will no longer have support. And like I said, what will likely happen, same thing that happened with Soviet communism or German Nazism, as soon as the leaders in that ideology was defeated militarily, the people gave up on that ideology as well. I think the same thing will happen even faster in Iran. The Iranian people are capable of perhaps more than any other country in the Muslim world aside from Indonesia. It used to be that Turkey actually enforced secularism, but the new Turkish president has started buddying up to the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's become a real radical. We thought that Turkey was the most Western of all the Muslim nations, and it turns out that they're not. I think Iran is going to be able to fill into that seat. My terms of surrender, in case you don't want to watch the whole video that I rolled out yesterday, it's at the very end. The terms of surrender are fourfold. They're very simple. 1, no more nuclear weapons. 2, no more long-range ballistic missiles. We still want them to have some missile capacity to deter their hostile Sunni neighbors. 3, no more death to America, no more death to Israel. They have to sign the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel as a sovereign state and normalize relationships with them. And number 4 was, what was the fourth? What was the fourth thing that I had in their terms of surrender? Forgive me. Of course, they have to abolish the Republican Guard, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi rebels, Islamic Jihad, and Quds Force, and live in peace with its neighbors, especially the Shiite majority in Iraq. We got to figure out how to have them hands off, but yet still being willing to engage in commerce with their friends. I mean, that's the thing about Iraq, is that it is 80% Shiite, and so there is a natural fellowship there between Shias. But nonetheless, we got to make sure that they are not screwing around with the fledgling Republic of Iraq, which apparently is struggling, it's groping its way towards a secular republic, and that's a good thing. For agreeing to these terms, America promises, I suggest that we promise three things: an end to all hostility, an end to all economic sanctions. We're open for business on day one, and three, that we'll give them a 10-year protectorate against all their enemies in the region, all of the nations in the region. In other words, we'll make it very clear to any nation that if you mess with Iran, you're messing with America. We've got to give Iran the opportunity to choose whatever kind of government it wants. It may be a monarchy, it may be a mixed government of some kind. Who knows? They may have something completely new up their sleeves. America needs to make the case very, very clear that we are no longer in the business of minding other people's business. They are free to do as they wish, so long as their interests don't collide with ours. And they're free to institute whatever government they want, lever their taxes however they want, and nice and easy Japanesey. So anyways, I know that's a bit of a rambling, kind of all over the place thing here. And I am going to go through all the demographics at some point, so that way you can get a sense of how this region really, really works. But nonetheless, hopefully you got an oversight here that you're not going to get anywhere else in the media today. I'm Darren Moore. You've been watching Another Way. If you like what you heard here today, please hit that like button, subscribe so that way you don't miss future things, hit that alert bell, make sure you get all the alerts, and please share this on social media if you thought that this was worthwhile. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you.